So my job is to talk a little bit about acquired brain injury. So the first section would be common causes. In my experience in working with people in some parts of the justice system who have sort of a generic client load, they don't necessarily know about acquired brain injury. So the acquired part means that somebody suffered some injury to their brain or some damage to their brain sometime after birth. And oftentimes people recognise that trauma can be responsible for that, trauma as in a blow to the head, but there are many diverse causes. So trauma is one example, things like a car accident, an assault, sporting accident or a fall, a weekend warrior who is up on the ladder fixing the house and falls over and hits their head. Anoxic events like near drowning, drug overdose, heart attack. For example, in a heart attack, where the brain is not getting the blood and the oxygen, the heart is not getting the blood and the oxygen up to the brain, so you get cell death. Most people are familiar with strokes, inflammation, meningitis, tumours, where you have masses of cells growing in unhelpful ways in the brain, impacting on how the brain operates. Alcohol-related brain injury, people drinking substantial amounts of alcohol for a fair period of time. And then a large collection of progressive neurological disorders like the dementias. So if you're not familiar with this group, you can imagine if you start looking at the prevalence rates, and you can get the hospital exit rates for most of these causes, this is a huge collection of people in Australia, and a really diverse collection of people as well, which is I think one of the reasons why it's so difficult for people who aren't working in the brain injury area to do the kinds of interventions they would like, because each of these individuals has diverse personalities and circumstances, very individualised when the acquired injury occurs, and then they bring the various sequelae of the injuries to that existing person. So it makes for the need for very individualised interventions, which is a real challenge for the service system. So after causes, my second point would be about common sequelae. The consequences, the outcomes of the injuries. Typically these get spoken about in domains, the cognitive domain, behavioural, emotional, mental illness. This is by no means exhaustive, but these are just the big ones. Cognitive issues, things like impairments in recall. Most people who've worked in brain injury will recognise memory impairments and problems with new learning. New information doesn't stick. You'll tell a client about something in the morning, soon after they may well have forgotten it, and even if in some cases they can describe things to you soon afterwards, they won't necessarily follow through on it. They may not know nothing about it the next day. Difficulties with insight, not recognising that there is a particular kind of problem, or in fact that they have a role in that problem. Concentration is another tough one for people not familiar with the area. It's very hard to progress therapeutically with someone who finds it very difficult to stick on task for any period of time, with their attention wavering. The more obvious ones or overt ones, the behavioural issues like the aggressions and sexualised behaviour, or if you like the negative behaviours like reduced initiation, where somebody is not doing very much and can often be labelled as lazy. Lazy is a difficult word. It kind of just means someone's not doing something you'd like them to do. It's hard to formulate that, but it may be in brain injury that they have an organic adonamia and their starter motor is broken and they just cannot get up and rolling the way you would hope somebody would. Emotional, people can be quite labile. Their emotional responses to things can be out of proportion to the actual events, or their emotional state may change very rapidly, might be quite reactive. And the big one at the bottom, mental illness. We in Victoria have tended to try to separate things like intellectual disability and mental illness and acquired brain injury. The figures across the studies indicate that if you've had a brain injury, you're at risk of having mental illness, and your odds are something like 1 in 2 across the next decade after your brain injury. So there are many people with mental health conditions, and vice versa. Mental health conditions are a risk factor for getting a brain injury. And then one of the things people ask is, well, what's all this got to do with the justice system, and why is it that these people are presenting in such large prevalence numbers in the justice system like we looked at earlier? If you look down that first column, common ABI sequelae, and then the second column, where someone may contravene the law, If you think somebody with really poor recall skills, poor organisational skills, it's not difficult for them to breach orders. This is one of the most common things that occur, and we'll hear from corrections later on in the day. And Victoria is not a good state, and it's not a great time at the moment to be breaching the conditions of your order, because we've got a fairly tight response to that. And corrections are, I think they'll say themselves, losing more and more discretion about what they can do with things like breaches. So forgetting that you actually have an appointment or not being able to get yourself organised to get to an appointment can lead to a breach, and that will have you in trouble with the justice system. Being impulsive and stealing things, I've had numerous clients do that. They may be very remorseful afterwards. It might seem strange if you're not familiar with it. They've made a mistake, seen the money, seen the object, seen the phone and grabbed it and run, and then been incredibly remorseful afterwards, but it's kind of too late then because the police are on the doorstep and we've started to get on the slippery slope into the justice system. People might have impaired planning and insight difficulties, ignoring legal notices, not really paying much attention to how important these things are, letterheads from the court, from the sheriff, not paying fines. There's been numerous research work done in Victoria as well about how much our legal system is kind of filled up with a lot of people in a lot of trouble for not paying fines, tens of thousands of dollars not funded, and what we can do about that. And for many people is simply that they just simply cannot process the kind of documentation they're receiving in the mail or getting themselves organised to follow through on an appropriate response to that. Low frustration tolerance can lead to assault either as a perpetrator or a victim, and I think when Damien talks later on, he'll give you an account of how speaking quickly to the copper can get you in a lot of trouble if you speak before thinking. And you may not be able to see that at the bottom, but there's a nice quote there from somebody called French. It says, "These kinds of difficulties create a cycle whereby a person gets charged, convicted and sentenced rather than treated, rehabilitated and supported in the community." And it's that latter group that we think could be much better off handled outside of the justice system, working with the treatment towards the sequelae of their brain injury rather than taking a legal response to them. And my last point is about compensation status. One of the things that's come up repeatedly in our conversations, particularly with people in things like post-release services and the public system, is that attending to somebody's compensation status is not necessarily something that they'd be concerned about, and they may not ask. They treat clients as generic clients oftentimes and just work with them as they present. However, Victoria does have a two-tiered system. We've got a public client, and that might be somebody who's had something like a stroke or a fall from a ladder or a sporting accident where they're not necessarily insured for their brain injury that can result from that, unless they have private insurance. And so then they start competing for limited resources in the public system. That may not be enough for what they need to recover as fully as they could. That's changing as we shift towards the NDIS, but who knows where that's going to go. But then you have the compensable clients as well. People that have got their brain injuries through car accidents and work accidents, where there are state-based insurance schemes and there are state-based acts that detail what legal entitlements people have to rehabilitation and other supports. And one of the things that we find commonly is that people in the public system often will not check a client's compensation status. And just as a vignette through this project, there's been one of those cases where a person was, I think, in prison for the third or fourth time and was entitled to compensation supports but had not accessed them. And so there's a window of opportunity during which you can claim. Not everybody who's been injured in a work or a car accident can necessarily claim supports through those systems, but many can. And in the vignette that arose out of this project was that the support workers hadn't investigated the person's compensation status. Once they did, they realised they were entitled to a range of supports and started getting those in place. And our projection now is that the person is far less likely to go back to prison. At this point, as an estimate, a couple of years ago in Victoria we had an ABI clinician working in the prisons, and that person's job was to screen prisoners and try to determine the ones that had an acquired brain injury and then develop appropriate plans for their release, support plans for their release, and that work's been published. That person saw something like 300 clients and estimated that 50% of the prisoners with brain injury had brain injury from a motor vehicle accident. based on the records that they could get access to. This is a lot of people, and often those people will just get released and that information won't carry with them, especially if they're poor historians and they don't tell the next worker. So what I would argue is what you need to know is you need to know a person's compensable status. Have they got a claim? Even if they don't have one or haven't lodged one, maybe they're eligible for it. So you should do things like ask the client. They may know not what you're talking about, not know the answer. Informants may know. The lawyers may know. You may need to call the insurance agency. But essentially, if the case is on your desk, do some work around that issue and see whether your client is in the private or the public sector, or like some of them, a little bit of both. Because they may well be entitled to things they're not getting that would be really helpful to you. They're my 3 points. So, question and answer. Are there any questions?
My name's Russell and I'm with ABI, brain injury people. I just wanted to clarify, it's a silly question, about the cost of keeping people in prison and the $100,000 per annum. And I'm just wondering whether that includes the processing of those people through the police and through the courts and then through the correction service at the end as well, whether that $100,000 is just to keep the people in prison or whether that's about processing them through the system as well, or whether there's an added cost on top of that for, because a lot of my people have been in 15, 20 times, and I'm just wondering whether that processing is an added cost to that as well. That was my question.
Excellent question, and the short answer from me is I don't know the answer to that. The most recent time I saw that figure, thanks Andrew, Karen, just look behind you, there might be an answer with Andrew. The most recent figure I saw around that $100,000, that's often quoted, was the Ombudsman's report that's just been released this year. But I didn't read in that, and I may have missed it, the definition of exactly what processes are involved in that calculation. So it may be that it's the cost of staying in prison plus that extra processing. But Andrew over there looks like he might have the answer.
I'm not a researcher in this area, but I have no doubt that the $100,000 is the yearly cost of keeping some, and it'd be more than that now, and it wouldn't include the other matters. I have no doubt about it, but I can't give you a citation, but I'd be happy to go and try and find out. I don't have any doubt sitting here.
The answer would come from the researchers in the Ombudsman's office who would have set the definition for those calculations.
My name's Simone from the Department of Human Services. I just have a question about an opinion. Do you see the childhood trauma stuff or cumulative trauma that we might see in the child protection system, would you view that as acquired or being an acquired injury to the brain for the child?
God, that's a good question. This is good. This is what this day is for, these kinds of sticky questions. You know, I'm not handballing this. I've seen people who have been through some horrific trauma, if you like, psychological and physical trauma in the past, but it's not necessarily traumatic blows to the head, and yet they present like they are brain injured with those kinds of cognitive problems we describe. But those kinds of organic damage to the brain are not the only causes for those kinds of presentations. So I think your question is around a differential diagnosis, really, and down the back is a pediatric neuropsychologist, Genevieve, who would do such diagnostic assessments.
Some of my other neuropsychology colleagues may also be able to make comments about this as well, but I guess it's there is sort of well known that the effects of stress hormones on the developing brain do impact on how the brain sort of organises itself early on in the piece. So, they actually sort of know that stress, particularly chronic stresses for children, and if they don't have sort of an attachment figure or somebody who can sort of, buffer the child against the stresses in their environment, it does actually impact on their brain development. And I guess you see that sort of kids who've been through, war zones and things like that as well as sort of, the war zone within the home as well. So any other neuropsychs wanted to... So Alexia, have you got any...
I really just wanted to confirm, I guess, what Genevieve was saying in terms of the impact of early life stress. A lot of the research that confirms the fact that this early life stress has an impact upon brain functioning comes from really, those cases overseas in terms of, the Romanian orphans, that kind of very, very stressful early life experiences. It's much more difficult in our setting to be able to identify the magnitude of the stress and the trauma that the child has experienced. Having said that, my feeling is that it probably should be considered a kind of ABI, and certainly, the kinds of Yeah, memory, attention, those kinds of difficulties that young people who've experienced trauma early in life tend to manifest or can manifest really does have an impact that looks very much like an ABI.
I just wondered whether what the breakdown was in terms of, I imagine prison itself is also a risk factor for the emergence of a new ABI within being in a community prison population, and wondered whether that's accounted for in any figures.
So that question was basically, I think, does going to prison put you at risk of getting brain injured? Am I right?
Yeah.
There are, and I couldn't quote those figures to you because I'm not on top of them. I'm not sure whether any of the researchers are in this room, but from the reading that I've done, yeah, assault, and so from a physical trauma point of view, it's assault, and from psychological, it's rape.
My name's Helene, I work for the TAC. I am going to make the most of the information available here today because I'm really stumped with a client at the moment. I work directly with 15 clients who have severe behaviours of concern along with severe acquired brain injury. So I currently have a client who I went to see in Port Phillip Prison a couple of weeks ago who's been in and out of prison this year 4 times. And right now we're really stuck between what is compensable. Obviously, I have a job to do for the TAC, but also making sure that he gets all the supports that he needs. So I know my end about what I can do and what the TAC can do, but I have no knowledge whatsoever about what are the services available for this guy in the community as a result of being incarcerated, you know, in and out 4 times this year. So I'm really keen to find out what services are available. We're not specialists, obviously, in this area, so we want to make sure that this guy gets everything he needs to, I really want to keep him out of prison. That's my biggest goal, and he's been in there 4 times this year, and the odds aren't looking good for him. So if anyone can help me with that, would be awesome.
I could try a 2-part answer. The first one will be, this is my personal take on it, you start with the behaviour. It's somehow you need to address and manage the behaviour that's getting into trouble, and depending on the formulation for that, dictates who gets involved. And then there's the service system itself. Now, we've got somebody from AXO here, at least one person, haven't we? Can you reveal yourself? Yeah.
So I spoke to his lawyer a couple of days ago, and she was adamant around the TAC paying for specialist accommodation for this guy, and she was under the belief that this specialist accommodation would fix him. She wasn't willing to go to the underlying factors of why he's actually breached an intervention order 4 times against a partner in the past, so there's other people's lives at risk at the moment. But she was totally oblivious to, we need to get underneath and find out why he's breaching these intervention orders and what the issues are. So, yeah, that was really interesting. Yeah.
This is one of the difficulties, and each person will come at it with their set of blinkers, if you like, or from their framework or the pressures that are on them to do their part of the job, which is why we kind of need this multidisciplinary approach. But it's just, the other part of my question was about what's happened in Victoria in the last 12 months or so is that the post-release or getting out of prison services, that system's been turned on its head. New labels, new services, new approaches. But the big players, am I right, remain AXO, VACRO, Jesuits, Brosnan, so forth. And those agencies have a raft of services available for people post-release. So knowing exactly what the services are, they've changed. Am I right? Some services get defunded, others have been commenced. And it's really has been in a state of flux, am I right, for the last 6 months or so, 12 months?
I should explain, my employer is ABI IOD, and I sit in the AXO Reconnect program in Dandenong, so
Okay.
I've got 2 employers. But yeah, so that explains that. And luckily for me, I've only been with AXO Reconnect since March, and it's been the AXO Reconnect program since the day I started. But yes, it's shifted.
So would it be right
continuously prior to that, I believe? Yeah.
at the moment, if somebody was hunting for post-release services, which isn't the same as an individualised formulation, but those services who work with this client group, and you'd hope be pretty cluey at it, it would be AXO, VACRO, Jesuits, Brosnan.
Correct.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah,
those-
geographically, yeah.
I'd be hitting up those agencies to see how things are structured in their services now.
I've got a client currently who lives in Heathmont, who is a TAC client and supported by me, AXO Reconnect program. So.
Thank you. I'm from Jesuit Social Services, and Neil and I are here from the Brosnan Centre. We work in adult justice, and we have Reconnect, which is the post-release support service for adults in the northwestern region of Melbourne. And a large number of our participants on that program would have acquired brain injury or suspected acquired brain injury. I've been in that service or in that agency for a few years, so I've seen the transition to what the program was from prior to Reconnect. And I think one of the key issues now is that where the emphasis under the old program last year was on, I guess, issues around vulnerability when people went back to the community, which might look at things like disability, mental health, drug and alcohol issues. The entire focus really now of this program is on the offending, so it's on the prevalence is on, or the priority is on support for serious violent offenders and serious sex offenders, and that's the focus, which wouldn't eliminate a lot of people that we'd work with, but all the referrals have to come from the programs area in the prison, so that's where the referral pathway comes from. We can't just contact Jesuit Social Services and say I've got a client. It has to come through Port Phillip Prisons program department. Do you want to add anything to that, Neil?
Yeah, so Neil Baxendale from the Reconnect program with Jesuit Social Services. In order to access the post-release service, there's a pathway that starts at the beginning of someone's sentence. VACRO actually work within the prisons on what is called the Relink program. But as Bridget said, it's now we deal with primarily or predominantly serious people with very complex needs. So a lot of people who would have got the service before now slip under the net. So, but I would advise your person to talk to the VACRO worker within Port Phillip.
So could I ask a question? Yeah, just while you run down the back. A couple of years ago, we had the good fortune of having, say, somebody like an ABI IOD clinician, and so that was really valuable to AOD workers around this kind of thing. And we had an ABI clinician working in the prisons who was a handy go-to person. So in this case, does anybody know the answer? Is there sort of the go-to person to say, this is the predicament I'm in, and I really need someone who's got an angle across this brain injury, prison, these various domains? What's your clinical perspective? What's the best way to move on from here? Is there one of those kind of linkage persons?
He's actually linked in with someone too from Care Connect, and I don't understand who they are or how they're involved. It's really difficult to sort of get to the bottom of services that have gone in before we get involved with some clients. And her attitude towards the TAC is very negative, so that's not helping either. So I'm sort of trying to fix that relationship up. So I'm not sure, she's like an advocate or something. I don't know. Yeah, so she's sort of linked in, but it's not kind of forwarding anything. So yeah, it's a really difficult situation for this guy.
Hi, my name's Saha. I work for a program called CROP, which is a bail app support program for guys in custody. He's probably not in custody at the moment, but we do link our guys up with support services post-release, so we can probably have a chat later. I can help you out.
I'm Jutta from Royal Talbot, ABI inpatient rehab. Haven't been there long, still confused, and this is a wonderful example for me. I'm wondering if there's anybody knows about a beautiful web page where I can find all these agencies, and if not, who's willing to put one up, because it really is so confusing. That's all. Thanks.
Yeah, okay. Since I'm standing here, I have to answer. I have a grand vision for Victorian ABI services. It's a mess. It's a mess. It's like, remember that political spaghetti chart that was done for the education system all those years ago? It's a bit like that. You're going to have to be around and know who's who, which is not helpful. But one of the things we would hope from today is that you would have a starting point, and Karen's going to talk about next starting points being high-task projects in regions and BrainLink centrally, and then going from there. And I suspect nobody can know everything, but we need some kind of trickle-down system that will work most of the time. And
also, it changes constantly, and that's a huge problem.
yeah, so that magic web page you want, I think, doesn't exist, but there are things that are helpful, and Karen's going to talk about some of them.
Wondering if the booklet's going to provide that or something.
It'll provide a
that
lot
kind.
of it. So that booklet is a rights and resources guide, and it will provide a lot of that as well, and you'll be sent one.
Yay.
And the theme of that booklet is for service providers to help them understand more about brain injury and some useful nuts and bolts sorts of features, but also a lot more about the justice system, so they can get their head around where they are at in that system and what might be the next thing they need to do. Thanks. Good questions.